Artificial intelligence might be the words of the day, the month, the year. I can't even think of how many times I've talked about AI and its applications in journalism, in public information law, in democracy, in law in general over the past year or so of being at CommonWealth. But we have just made it through another year of presidential elections and elections all over the globe. So we're going to talk today about AI and how it actually looked during this election cycle. I'm Jennifer Smith, and this is the Codcast, Commonwealth Beacon's podcast about policy and civic life here in Massachusetts. Today, I'm joined by Professor Bruce Schneier, a fellow and lecturer in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, and Nathan Sanders, affiliate at Harvard's Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. Bruce, Nathan, thank you so much for joining me. I'm really excited to get to piece through some of your now pretty robust collection of work on AI and democracy.
Yeah, it seems to be a thing a lot of people are writing about, but in very different ways.
And we're thrilled to join you. Thank you for having us.
So it is helpful in part, as you note, Bruce, because people are writing about this in different ways and from different perspectives to sort of help our listeners understand your positioning before we get into this sort of conversation. So I wonder if we can go through and talk about how you would sort of describe your feelings broadly about artificial intelligence right now. There's optimists, there's cautious optimists, there's rejectionists, there's people that are just watching closely and keeping their fingers crossed. Where would you put yourselves?
I like to think that we're realists, that we see this as a transformative technology in many different areas, both for good and for bad. We see this as a tool being used by humans, and humans use tools for both good and for bad. And we do think it'll be transformational in many areas of society, including democracy. Most of what we hear involves AI and deep fakes, right? AI making up stuff. And we think that the applications are much broader than that. We think about AIs assisting politicians doing politics, assisting legislators, assisting judges, and assisting citizens. So there are different ways these technologies will change how democracy works.
And then Nathan, how do you position yourself?
I think that's right, exactly as Bruce said. And I think we don't fall in any of the kind of extremes that you mention. In particular, I think although we're very concerned about the applications of AI for disinformation, for misinformation and propaganda online, we think that's a very real and legitimate concern. As Bruce said, that's not the only way that AI is being used. And so I think that probably does make us a little bit more optimistic about the technology than some others writing in this space. We're also trying to think through not only what is happening today, how AI is being used in the wild today in politics and elections, but also what's going to happen in the future. So for example, for years now, we've seen legislators around the world at the local and federal level starting to use AI in drafting bills, in writing speeches, in writing testimony that's delivered on the floors of legislatures. What is the long-term ramification of that? How could that shift the balance of power between legislative and executive branches? Those are the type of extrapolations we're trying to think about. And the reason we're so interested in this is because we don't think any of those changes are inevitable, but we really want to help society steer the application of this technology in a way that's productive, in a way that's equitable, in a way that's beneficial for democracy. That kind of positive outcome is not guaranteed, but I think it's much more likely if we all work together towards it.
One of my favorite questions to bring up, because I'm a child of Silicon Valley, I grew up during some of the earlier tech booms out there, is that AI seems to kind of be tagged onto almost any type of technology at this point. You have the sort of inevitable hype cycles. So I think it would be helpful, at least for me, before we really get into this, to see how you specifically, Bruce, because we'll get into this on the legislative side of it more, I think, when I chat with Nathan. But when someone says artificial intelligence, do you assume that that's being used as a blanket category for anything using a certain kind of algorithmic system, or is that saying something very specific to you these days? How helpful is the term right now?
It really depends on who's using it. It's all over the map. You'll see press articles that use it to mean anything involving a lot of math. Or you see it being used to only refer to large language model generative AI. What we're using is a sort of a broad basket of technologies that largely mimic human thought. And yes, generative AI produces all sorts of text on both true and false, on topics interesting and mundane. But there's predictive AI that will play chess and will read chest x-rays and will forecast the weather. A wholly different form of AI. But these are all tasks that until now have been only tasks that humans can do. They're thinking tasks. Now that's hard. For many years, AI was only things that couldn't be done. And when it could be done, it was like no longer AI. But we're really reaching the point where a lot of these AI systems are able to replace humans in a wide variety of tasks. Sometimes good, sometimes bad. I mean, they could be better, they could be worse, but they're like viable alternatives for one reason or another.
So the primary reason that we're chatting today is that you both co-wrote a piece for The Conversation called The Apocalypse That Wasn't. AI was everywhere in 2024's elections, but deepfakes and misinformation were only part of the picture. We love a provocative title here, but let's walk through a little bit about what that means. Because, of course, if the noteworthy thing is that an apocalypse didn't happen, that sort of presumes that people expected it to. So when you were thinking about what the potential impact of AI could be on 2024 elections, what were you looking for?
Well, I'll say we took a broad sweep of impacts of AI in the 2024 elections. And by the way, we were thinking not only about the 2024 US presidential election, but also elections around the world. We did examine the use of AI to generate deepfakes, misinformation, and propaganda. There were certainly examples of that in the past year, including some really prominent examples in Europe that we talked about, including the case of the AI deepfake of Joe Biden's voice that played a role in the New Hampshire primary election this year. So we call those out as significant, but also noted that they don't seem to have been determinative in any election that we're aware of around the world. And that's why we say that the apocalypse hasn't happened. But there are so many other examples of AI being used in the wild that we thought were interesting and called out. A large category of uses in political campaigning by campaigns that are starting to use AI to support the roles of campaign staff and volunteers in doing things like canvassing, speaking with voters, generating campaign materials, again, in the US and around the world. Some really interesting examples of congressional candidates that were producing podcasts, producing content for their websites, more fully articulating their policy positions using generative AI in a way that a local candidate may not be able to do with a small amount of resources on their own. And we think those kinds of use cases have opportunities to go wrong, but also could be really equalizing in a democracy where there is, widely disparate access to resources. And particularly in local elections, it can be hard to enable people from every constituency to even run for office. And AI technologies there could make a difference in helping make that playing field more equal.
So I'm glad that you brought up the Joe Biden example because, of course, in New Hampshire, for those who hadn't been following it, a company that was facilitated by a political consultant sent out robocalls mimicking President Joe Biden's voice, falsely suggesting, if I recall correctly, that voting in the New Hampshire presidential primary would in some way preclude them from voting in the November general election. And that company has since agreed to pay $1 million fine. So was that the sort of thing that when you were looking at, say, Pew polling on how people worried that AI might influence the election, that was sort of the introductory level of how people were thinking about how AI and elections might interact, that kind of fear?
Very much introductory level. We were worried that there would be fake videos, fake images that would distort reality and that people would believe them. That was the fear, that they would be created by the other side, by foreign actors, that this disinformation would overwhelm the actual information.
And so what you note, which I thought was quite interesting, is that it doesn't appear that these were as influential as many feared. And the thing that came to mind for me is that a useful metric here, that the thing is that the tech influenced or facilitated lies didn't really work that well? Why would we sort of look at it in terms of effectiveness rather than kind of the scale or interest in using them that way?
I wanted to call out, I think part of the reason why we haven't seen an apocalyptic outcome is that there has been a high awareness and people really on the lookout for these types of uses of AI for deepfakes and misinformation. And I really, truly want to credit the media here for really jumping on this case that happened in New Hampshire and immediately reporting on the fact that this was a fake robocall, and I think informing the electorate not to trust that. And by the way, that kind of a robocall with a faked voice certainly could have been done without AI. There are plenty of humans that are good at impersonating voices too. That's not really an attack that's specific to the technology of AI. And likewise, I think the media's the important role of the media in exposing that kind of misinformation is equally important for misinformation created by AI as misinformation created in more traditional ways. We also talk in the article about some of the interesting ways that AI is used to automatically detect and moderate content and is helping to expose these types of propagation of disinformation. We give the example of OpenAI systems, which were able to detect an apparent Iranian plot to infuse conversation online with AI-generated misinformation about the election. So AI plays a role, for better or worse, on both sides of this.
And a lot of this is older than AI. I mean, Stalin was airbrushing people out of photos in the 50s. So what's changing from Stalin's work to Photoshop in the 80s to generative AI today are the number of people who can do the thing and the skills you need to do it. And as everyone is able to go on to DALL-E and create a fake image, I think they lose their potency because we all know it can be done. And a lot of memes, we know about memes, what's shared on the internet, is less about what's true and more about social signaling. I mean, I send you the thing because we're on the same team. And that's how we show that we're on the same team. And truth matters less. But it does seem that, there's lots of misinformation. I think about the two things in the last weeks of the election. One was Haitians eating pets, and the other was FEMA's out to get you. Those themes had nothing to do with AI.
Right. And so I think that there's an interesting angle and overlap there that you've correctly identified in the context of this election fraud or misinformation or disinformation landscape. There was recently quite an interesting discussion at the Federal Election Commission about whether AI should be treated differently than any other kind of misleading election behavior. So as you note, if you personally Photoshop some sort of misleading statement from a politician or claim that someone wasn't there or was there, it may look very similar to asking AI to create that same sort of thing. And I wonder to what extent you're considering, as you note, that this is something that's very available to people now. Is the issue the ease and the scale of these tools right now, or is it more useful in your research to kind of treat these as an extension of existing attempts at election interference or misinformation?
I think you framed it perfectly because I really think it's both those things exactly. We should think of these technologies as extending existing capabilities. Most of the impacts that we see of AI on democracy are not sort of new, novel, or kind of bizarre contortions of existing political processes, but rather giving people the ability to do the things that humans have traditionally done at greater scale, at a greater scope, with more sophistication. And so that means we need to think about two things. We need to think about how we regulate activities in the political domain, whether they're done, perpetrated by AI or by humans. And we need to think about what happens when those types of activities are done at a greater scale. I'd love to come back to the example of the FEC as well, because that rulemaking process or lack thereof is something we've thought and written a lot about. The issue at hand there was whether the FEC's existing prohibition on fraudulent misrepresentation, for example, the Joe Biden AI deepfake, should explicitly apply to misrepresentation using AI or not. Of course, the original rule was not written with AI in mind. It was written years ago. And it seems to be a gray area whether or not you're violating that rule if you use AI to do it. And the FEC ultimately declined to issue any new rulemaking on that. And there was quite some division among the commissioners about whether or not that clarification was necessary or whether it's already obvious that it applies to AI. I think the fact that the question came up makes it clear it is not obvious and it needs clarification. The broader point that we've made is that there is a lack of statutory authority, clarity on statutory authority from Congress about whose job it is to police political disinformation. The FEC, the FECC, the FTC all have some varying roles in this, and they're overlapping, and there are clear cases where there's frankly a turf war between the agencies, and as a result, often these activities just go unregulated. Also, of course, those commissions have very limited resources to actually enforce even the regulations that have already been made. So we've really urged Congress to take more action to clarify the divisions between those agencies and to make sure that they're really staffed and equipped to handle the types of increasing political activity that AI will enable, even if it doesn't look that different from what humans have done in the past.
And one of the things that you brought up in a few of the articles that you've written is the maybe flip side to that malevolent framing, which is the use of AI-generated emails, texts, audio, and video that people have been able to use to reach large numbers of possible voters. That's really fascinating to me from either a campaign technique perspective and then also what it feels like to the people receiving those messages, because I'm someone who sees a lot of political emails go out and who's shadowed many a candidate knocking on doors in person. So it strikes me on just sort of a flesh and blood level that it feels different somehow to know that there might be outreach that's essentially, concocted by algorithm, but is that just not how people are receiving it? What did you learn about that kind of outreach tool?
So we've talked to a lot of people who have companies or programs to aid candidates in outreach and fundraising and all these things. And it does seem that these are effective. You have to know, when you got that campaign email 2 years ago, the candidate didn't write it. It was written by somebody else. And if that somebody else is a low-level staffer and is edited by a senior staffer and becomes something good, the candidate approves it, or maybe they don't. Or it's written by an AI and then a senior staffer edits it and it's approved or not. It's very much the same process. We saw applications in language translation, either real time or after the fact, allowing candidates to reach a more diverse constituency. There was an example in Pakistan of someone who is jailed and was able to give speeches through an AI avatar. There's an example from Japan of a little-known candidate who used an AI avatar to engage with thousands of voters and do better in the election than anyone thought possible. So a lot of really interesting examples of these being used by candidates in positive ways. Sort of remains to be seen what voters are going to think. Are they going to feel shortchanged when an AI answers an email instead of a person? Or did they feel shortchanged when a staffer answered an email instead of the candidate? I think a lot of it's going to be acclimatization as people get used to the fact that the candidate doesn't write the speech, doesn't sign the Christmas card, doesn't do any of those things, that it'll be okay. But also think about candidates for local offices that don't have a staff, that don't have a budget, that basically have no ability to respond in any personal way because they're just doing this part-time. I think this will make a big deal at local elections, making it more possible for more diverse people to run for office.
I'm so interested in the concept of disclosure as it pertains to AI. So I suppose the meta question here is, does this sort of thing only work when people think they're getting human outreach, or is there something else happening? Because in journalism surveys, people interestingly wanted outlets to definitely label products that were created by AI so they knew that where it was coming from, but then they also said that they judged those outlets for using AI. So there was sort of a perverse incentive that seemed to be, don't disclose it if you're using it, even if you feel that you have to. So is that something that you've thought about or looked at when it comes to AI use in politics, where things should be labeled as using AI and how detailed the description of how that AI is being used is?
So I'm not sure that it's necessary to label a message that was originally drafted by an AI and approved by a candidate as being AI generated any more than we would expect a text message that was written by a staffer and approved by a campaign to be disclosed that was written by a staffer. However, I think, especially for interactive use cases, if you might be engaged in a one-on-one conversation in text messaging or in a campaign website with an AI avatar, in that sort of use case that is personalized and individualized, it absolutely should be disclosed. And I'm not aware of any cases of AI use in the wild for campaigning that have failed that kind of disclosure criteria to date, but I am confident that will happen in the future and that there will be misrepresentation of when you're talking to an AI or not. And I think it is important that we establish real disclosure regulations, which I don't think we have right now in the US, certainly at the federal level, so that there is not confusion among the electorate in the future.
And there's going to be a lot of use of AI that isn't generative. I mean, I don't disclose that I got to you using Google Maps, even though that is an AI tool. And if AI is being used to figure out who to target for fundraising or to understand who is lobbying what bill, I mean, there'll be a lot of those use cases where almost disclosure doesn't make sense just because it's integrated into the normal tools people are using. I don't ask my students to disclose that they use a spell checker, even though that is now an AI product. There's going to be an acclimatization as we get used to the integration of these tools in our lives. We're going to less expect them to be disclosed. We're in moments where these are new and scary and potentially disruptive. So they make more cases that we actually want to know.
It's funny because that very much does get to the thing that I've been struggling with over the year or so that I've been reporting on AI applications, which is, what is different, if anything, about text to voice in the 90s versus text to voice now, except now it's always got like an AI slapped on it, even if the tech looked very familiar. Google Translate was not labeled AI until relatively recently. It was just a translation software, even though the underlying kind of mechanics of it feel very similar. I think this leads into a piece that you wrote for Boston Review on what I think you called it the trust issue of AI. So to summarize briefly, there are a few ways to measure AI's usefulness. They're getting better at passing, say, information and reasoning-based tests, but in part because of the corporate control of these AI products, it's hard to know how they work and therefore how trustworthy they are. So I suppose my question here is, does trusting an algorithm or trusting an AI tool mean something different than trusting a person in general?
And the answer is yes. I mean, historically, it's trusting a computer. And we have biases here. We have the computer is always right bias, which has not served us well, but a lot of people believe. It is automatic in a way a person is not. It makes mistakes differently. It behaves differently. And I don't think you can just substitute a person with an algorithm, whether it's AI or not, and say the trust is the same. In one case, there's a human connection. Another case, there might be some large faceless corporation. So I think that's actually really complicated. We're still just figuring out what that trust means.
If I could add to that, I do think that the corporate control of AI that we have today, the fact that the major AI models are primarily led and developed by private corporations that are necessarily operating for their own interest, for their own profit motive, that corporate control is a fundamental limiter of trust in AI systems. I think that's true both in practice and how we see populations around the world reacting with a lot of anxiety about AI. And it's also true in principle. It is the case that those companies will be acting in their own interests and not on our individual interests, and also not building tools that are meant to benefit democracy necessarily. And so Bruce and I, together with a network of scholars around the world, have been exploring and advocating for an alternative path to AI development that we call public AI. These would be AI models that are different fundamentally in that they're not developed for private interest and for a profit motive, but rather for the public interest. And there are different ways that you can do that, but one way is by empowering governments to actually build their own AI models and their own applications of AI models that are really purpose-built under civic oversight for applications and the use of the type of political and democratic systems that we're talking about. So, for example, earlier we talked about the use of AI for content moderation to limit extreme speech or disinformation shared in online forums. And I think, frankly, corporate AI models have been really deficient in those kinds of use cases. We've seen some really prominent examples of content moderation AI tools failing on platforms like Facebook. And I don't think there would be trust in applying those types of tools to democratic processes like engagement between citizens and legislatures. I don't think we'd want to use those AI tools as they exist today for moderating discussion in a public forum like a town hall. But I think we could build systems that can achieve much greater trust if they're developed with greater transparency, if they're developed with meaningful public participation and public control of the design of those systems and how they're used. And I think it's necessary that we have an alternative to corporate-controlled AI to do that.
And that leads in, of course, into how these tools are currently interacting with democratic institutions and softwares that are looking to increase transparency and access to notoriously opaque democratic institutions. Massachusetts is very familiar with that problem. So I wonder, Nathan, because as listeners may be aware, we first met in the context of your work on the Maple platform, the legislative platform. So talk to me a little bit about how you've been incorporating AI into that that. And again, the reason I bring this up in terms of disclosure is because there is the section that discloses this is how we're using it. And also we recommend that you read the underlying bills just in case there are any errors. So walk me through how you've been thinking about AI as a part of Maple.
Yeah, I'll be very glad to talk a little bit about Maple, which I hope could be really useful to a lot of your listeners, and then also how we're thinking about enhancing our platform with AI tools. So Maple is the Massachusetts platform for legislative engagement. It's online now at mapletestimony.org, and anyone can use it completely for free. It's an open source project that's been developed by a consortium of academics and volunteers at Northeastern and Harvard and Boston College and elsewhere that have come together to build this. What we're trying to do is to make it radically easier for all of us in Massachusetts to communicate with our state legislature and to be involved in the policymaking process around bills. Right now, anyone in principle can testify to the legislature and have their voice heard in a public hearing about any bill. But in practice, it's very hard to do that. In the past, primarily, it's meant you've had to, travel into Boston and maybe take a day off of work to testify in an oral hearing and sit in a room for hours. There's a way to submit written testimony so you don't have to do that, but it's often opaque and hard for people to know how they submit comments through that system. So we're just trying to make that much, much easier by having an online platform where you can easily look up any bill at mapletestimony.org, read information and learn about that proposed policy, and then just submit your testimony to the legislature in a way that's as easy as leaving a comment on a website. So Maple already facilitates that kind of use today, and we are enhancing it and looking forward to a version 2.0 release in January that adds even more features using AI. The two first ways that we're enhancing our tools with AI are one, to make bills more understandable to the average person. Often bills are very dense, very long, full of legalese, and even if you're a lawyer, you can't understand what they mean without following a network of references to section so-and-so of the Mass General Laws. But AI systems turn out to be quite good at following those kinds of links and summarizing information from very long and complex documents. And so we've developed AI summarization tools that will provide a simple, accessible summary of every bill before the legislature to make it easier for people to understand the policies that are being proposed. And the second thing we're doing is making it easier to navigate bills. In Massachusetts, we have one of the largest legislative agendas in the country. We typically have about 8,000 bills filed every year. On any subject you might be interested, there are often dozens of bills filed, and it can be very difficult to figure out which of those have a chance of moving, which of those are relevant to the content you're interested in. So we're also using AI tools to automatically tag those bills so you can more easily browse and navigate to the policies that may be impactful to you.
So I think the short and oddly hostile feeling and framework, even though I don't really mean it that way, is essentially when we're talking about the issue with these tools being trusting their accuracy, trusting how they work. We know that many large language model AI tools or predictive or quote unquote summary tools can hallucinate, can misinterpret what they're actually looking at here. So what is the utility of a bill summarization tool if this idea of trusting AI systems is still in this wobbly gray space?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right to call that out. And of course, as we've been building these tools, we've been very concerned about the potential for AI models to make mistakes. And so the first thing that we have done is put clear disclosures associated with AI summaries so that it's very evident to visitors that the summaries were written by AI models and could have mistakes. Importantly, we also provide all the legislative context, the full original text of the bill, so that people can look to more than just the summary, if they have that level of interest, to see what the full information that the summary was based on. We've also been trying to innovate in our use of the AI models to help mitigate the extent to which mistakes are made, and we think we've made a lot of progress in that in collaboration with academic researchers at BU and our other volunteer collaborators. The main way that we've done that is by really constraining the AI model with more context and more information. So for example, in addition to passing the bill text, we also do incorporate the original text of the Mass General Laws that specific bill is modifying. And we found that turns out to be very helpful in making sure that the bill doesn't make what you might think of as false assumptions or wrong conclusions about what the bill is going to be doing.
So I think this is where I would essentially kick it over to Bruce for last notes here. I'm sure this is not the last day of the year that you're going to be thinking about AI. You're going to be thinking about it going forward a lot, especially in terms of its applications to democratic transparency and equity and all of these sort of bound up concerns. So what are your next projects that you're kind of toying with right now or in progress on? And is there one thing that's a potential issue or boon in the AI space that you think is maybe skating under the radar? We're very focused on X. Are we missing Y?
So Nathan and I are writing a book on AI and democracy, which will be out in the fall, where we talk about all of these applications, both good and bad, and really how AI will affect every aspect of democracy. I think the thing that's most important, the thing we find that we're constantly hitting against is the notion of power. And whether AI serves existing power, thereby increasing already great power imbalances, or whether it can serve more distributed power, thereby reducing power imbalances. And to the extent it does that, to the extent it gives everyone better legal representation, that's a phenomenal thing for democracy. To the extent it allows more people to run for local office, that's phenomenal for democracy. But if it entrenches the existing power, whether it's corporate power or government power, then that's bad for democracy. And I think we really have to look at that. How do we build democratic AI, public AI, non-corporate AI, AIs that upset existing power imbalances and make us more democratic? And we have to watch that, where we're living in a world where there's a lot of power concentrated in very few hands. And the best uses of AI try to reverse that.
Thanks again to Professor Bruce Schneier and Nathan Sanders for joining me on the Codcast this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Jennifer Smith. Our producer is Claire Wigglesworth. And you can get in touch directly at codcast@commonwealthbeacon.org if you want me to hear anything from you. And of course, leave a rating and review wherever you're hearing this now if you want to help other folks find us. We'll be back next week.